brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Roy Orbison. Roy Kelton Orbison was an American singer-songwriter known for his distinctive impassioned voice, complex song structures and dark emotional ballads. The combination led many critics to describe his music as operatic, nicknaming him the Caruso of Rock and the Big O. Between 1960 and 1964, 22 of his songs placed on the Billboard Top 40, including Only the Lonely, Crying in Dreams, and Oh Pretty Woman. Born in Texas, Orbison began singing in a rockabilly and country and western band in high school. He was signed by Sam Phillips' Sun Records in 1956, but his greatest success came with Monument Records in the early 1960s. While most male rock and roll performers in the 1950s and 1960s projected a defiant masculinity, many of Orbison's songs instead conveyed a quiet, almost desperate vulnerability. His voice ranged from baritone to tenor, and music scholars have suggested that he had a 3 or 4 octave range. During performances, he was known for standing still and solitary and for wearing black clothes to match his jet black hair and dark sunglasses, which lent an air of mystery to his persona. From the late 1960s to late 1970s, Orbison was marred by a number of personal tragedies while his record sales declined. He experienced a resurgence in popularity through the success of several cover versions of his songs and the use of his 1963 song In Dreams in David Lynch's film Blue Velvet, and his hit Oh Pretty Woman as the title track to film Pretty Woman in 1990. In 1988, he co-founded the traveling Wilburys supergroup with George Harrison, Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, and Jeff Lynne. Orbison recorded his last solo album, Mystery Girl, the same year, but died of a heart attack shortly thereafter. His honors include inductions into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1987, the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame in the same year, and the Songwriters Hall of Fame in 1989. Rolling Stone placed him at number 37 on their list of the greatest artists of all time, and number 13 on their list of the 100 greatest singers of all time. In 2002, Billboard magazine listed Orbison at number 74 in the top 600 recording artists. Early life. Roy Kelton Orbison was born in Vernon, Texas, the middle son of Orbie Lee Orbison, an oil well driller and car mechanic, and Nadine Vesta Schultz, a nurse. Both of his parents were unemployed during the Great Depression and searching for work moved the family to Fort Worth when Roy was a child. He attended Denver Avenue Elementary School until a polio scare prompted the family to return to Vernon. Later they moved to Wink, Texas. Orbison later described life in Wink as football, oil fields, oil grease and sand, and expressed relief that he was able to leave the desolate town. All the Orbison children were afflicted with poor eyesight. Roy used thick corrective lenses from an early age. He was not confident about his appearance, and began dyeing his nearly white hair black when he was still young. He was quiet, self-effacing, and remarkably polite and obliging. A product biographer Alan Clayson wrote of his Southern upbringing: he was readily available to sing, however, and often became the focus of attention when he did. He considered his voice memorable, if not great. On Roy's 6th birthday, his father gave him a guitar. He later recalled that, "By the age of 7 I was finished, for anything else, music would be his life." His major musical influence as a youth was country music. He was particularly moved by Lefty Frizzle's singing with its slurred syllables. He also enjoyed Hank Williams and Jimmie Rodgers. One of the first musicians he heard in person was Ernest Tubb, who was playing on the back of a flatbed truck in Fort Worth. In West Texas he was exposed to many forms of music, sepia, Tex-Mex, the orchestral arrangements of Mantovani and Cajun. The Cajun favorite Joel Blon was one of the first songs he sang in public. Aged 8, he began singing on a local radio show. By the late 1940s he was the show's host. In high school, Orbison and some friends formed a band, the Wink Westerners. They played country standards and Glenn Miller songs at local honky-tonks and had a weekly radio show on Curbing Kermit. When they were offered $400 to play at a dance, Orbison realized that he could make a living in music. After graduating from Wink High School, he enrolled at North Texas State College in Denton, planning to study geology so that he could secure work in the oil fields if music did not pay. After his first year of college, he returned to Wink and continued performing with the Wink Westerners. 3 of the 5 members of the band moved to Odessa, Texas, and 2 new members were added to the group, which changed its name to the Teen Kings. Orbison enrolled in Odessa Junior College. The Teen Kings performed on local TV stations, played dances on the weekends, and attended college during the day. Orbison heard that his North Texas State classmate Pat Boone had signed a record deal, which further strengthened his resolve to become a professional musician. While living in Odessa, Orbison saw a performance by Elvis Presley, who was only a year older and a rising star. Johnny Cash toured the area in 1955, playing on the same local radio show as the Teen Kings, and suggested that Orbison approach Sam Phillips at Sun Records, the home of rockabilly artists Presley, Carl Perkins, Jerry Lee Lewis and Cash. Orbison telephoned Phillips, and during their conversation was curtly told, "Johnny Cash doesn't run my record company." While at North Texas State College, he was persuaded to listen to a song called Doobie Doobie, composed by Dick Penner and Wade Moore, in mere minutes atop a fraternity house at the college. The Teen Kings recorded the song on the Odessa-based Jewel record label. Phillips was impressed, and offered the Teen Kings a contract in 1956. 1957–59, Sun Records and Acuff Rose. The Teen Kings went to Sun's studio in Memphis, where Phillips wanted to record Doobie Doobie again. In his superior studio, Orbison had grown weary of the song, and rankled quietly as Phillips dictated what the band would play and how he was to sing it. With Phillips' production, however, the record broke into the Billboard Hot 100, peaking at number 59, and selling 200,000 copies. The Teen Kings toured with Sonny James, Johnny Horton, Carl Perkins, and Cash. Much influenced by Elvis Presley, Orbison performed frenetically, doing everything we could to get applause, because we had only one hit record. The Teen Kings also began writing songs in a rockabilly style, including Go, 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 and Rock House. The band ultimately split over disputed writing credits and royalties, but Orbison stayed in Memphis and asked his 16-year-old girlfriend Claudette Frady to join him there. They stayed in Phillips' home, sleeping in separate rooms. In the studio, Orbison concentrated on the mechanics of recording. Phillips remembered being much more impressed with Orbison's mastery of the guitar than with his voice. A ballad Orbison wrote, "The Clown," met with a lukewarm response. After hearing it, Sun Records producer Jack Clement told Orbison that he would never make it as a ballad singer. Orbison had some success at Sun Records, however, and was introduced to Elvis Presley's social circle, once going to pick up a date for Presley in his purple Cadillac. Orbison sold Claudette a song he wrote about Claudette Frady, whom he married in 1957, to the Everly Brothers, and their subsequent recording of it was released as the B-side of their smash hit All I Have to Do Is Dream. The first and perhaps only royalties Orbison earned from Sun Records enabled him to make a down payment on his own Cadillac. Increasingly frustrated at Sun, he gradually stopped recording. He toured music circuits around Texas and then quit performing for 7 months in 1958. In dire financial straits, his car repossessed, he turned to family and friends for funds. For a brief period in the late 1950s, Orbison made his living at Acuff Rose, a songwriting firm concentrating mainly on country music. After spending an entire day writing a song, he would make several demo tapes at a time and send them to Wesley Rose, who would try to find musical acts to record them. Orbison attempted to sell to RCA Victor his recordings of songs by other writers working with and being in awe of Chet Atkins, who had played guitar with Presley. One song he tried was "Seems to Me" by Boodle Bryant. Bryant's impression of Orbison was of a timid, shy kid who seemed to be rather befuddled by the whole music scene. "I remember the way he sang then, softly, prettily, but almost bashfully, as if someone might be disturbed by his efforts and reprimand him. Playing shows late into the night and living with his wife and young child in his tiny apartment." Orbison often sought refuge by taking his guitar to his car and writing songs there. Songwriter Joe Melson, an acquaintance of Orbison's, tapped on his car window one day in Texas in 1958, and the two decided to try to write some songs together. In 3 recording sessions in 1958 and 1959, Orbison and Melson recorded 7 songs at RCA Nashville, with Atkins producing, but only 2 were judged worthy of release by RCA. Wesley Rose brought Orbison to the attention of producer Fred Foster at Monument Records. 1960-64, Arrival and Monument Records. Orbison was one of the first recording artists to popularize the Nashville sound, doing so with a group of session musicians known as the A-Team: guitarists Grady Martin, Harold Bradley, Fred Carter Jr. and Ray Edenton, bassist Bob Moore, pianists Floyd Kramer, Ahagus Pig Robbins, drummer Buddy Harmon, and backup vocals by the Jordanaires of the Anita Kerr Singers. The Nashville sound was developed by producers Chet Atkins, Owen Bradley, Sam Phillips, and Fred Foster. In his first session for Monument in Nashville, Orbison recorded a song that RCA had refused, Paperboy, backed by With a Bug, but neither charted. According to musician and author Alban Zach, the studio, the production by Foster and the accompanying musicians gave Orbison's music a polished professional sound, finally allowing Orbison's stylistic inclinations free rein to augment the Nashville sound. Orbison requested a string section in the studio. With this combination, he recorded 3 new songs, the most notable of which was Uptown, written with Joe Melson. Impressed with the results, Melson later recalled, "We stood in the studio listening to the playbacks and thought it was the most beautiful sound in the world." The Rolling Stone Illustrated History of Rock and Roll states that the music Orbison made in Nashville brought a new splendor to rock, and compared the melodramatic effects of the orchestral accompaniment to the musical productions of Phil Spector. Uptown reached only 2 on the Billboard Top 100, and Orbison set his sights on negotiating a contract with an upscale nightclub somewhere. His initial success came just as the 50s rock and roll era was winding down. Elvis Presley was serving in the U.S. Army. Jerry Lee Lewis had become disgraced after marrying his 13-year-old cousin, and Buddy Holly had died in a plane crash. Starting in 1960, the charts in the U.S. came to be dominated by teen idols, novelty acts, and Motown girl groups. Writing for The Voice. Influenced by contemporaneous hits such as Come Back to Me and Come Softly to Me, Orbison and Joe Melson wrote a song in early 1960 which, using elements from Uptown, employed strings and the Anita Kerr doo-wop backing singers. It also featured a note hit by Orbison in falsetto that showcased a powerful voice which, according to biographer Clayson, came not from his throat, but deeper within. The song was Only the Lonely. Orbison and Melson tried to sell it to Elvis Presley and the Everly Brothers but were turned down. They instead recorded the song at RCA's Nashville studio, with sound engineer Bill Porter trying a completely new strategy, building the mix from the top down rather than from the bottom up, beginning with close mixed backing vocals in the foreground and ending with the rhythm section soft in the background. This combination became Orbison's trademark sound. The single shot to number 2 on the Billboard Hot 100 and hit number 1 in the UK and Australia. According to Orbison, the subsequent songs he wrote with Melson during this period were constructed with his voice in mind, specifically to showcase its range and power. He told Rolling Stone in 1988, "I liked the sound of my voice. I liked making it sing, making the voice ring, and I just kept doing it. And I think that somewhere between the time of Ooby Dooby and Only the Lonely it kind of turned into a good voice." Only the Lonely transformed Orbison into an overnight star. He appeared on American Bandstand, and toured the US for 3 months non-stop with Patsy Cline. When Presley heard Only the Lonely for the first time, he bought a box of copies to pass to his friends. Melson and Orbison followed it with a more complex Blue Angel, which peaked at in the US and won in the UK. I'm Hurtin' with I Can't Stop Loving You as the B-side rose to 7 in the US, but failed to chart in the UK. Orbison was now able to move his wife and son to Nashville permanently, back in the studio seeking a change from the pop sound of Only the Lonely and I'm Hurtin'. Orbison worked on a new song, Running Scared, based loosely on the rhythm of Ravel's Bolero. The song was about a man on the lookout for his girlfriend's previous boyfriend, who he feared would try to take her away. Orbison encountered difficulty when he found himself unable to hit the song's highest note without his voice breaking. He was backed by an orchestra in the studio, and Porter told him he would have to sing louder than his accompaniment because the orchestra was unable to be softer than his voice. Fred Foster then put Orbison in the corner of the studio and surrounded him with coat racks, forming an improvised isolation booth to emphasize his voice. Orbison was unhappy with the first 2 takes. In the third, however, he abandoned the idea of using falsetto and sang the final high A naturally, so astonishing everyone present that the accompanying musicians stopped playing. On that third take, Running Scared was completed. Fred Foster later recalled he did it, and everybody looked around in amazement. Nobody had heard anything like it before. Developing the image. Just weeks later, Running Scared reached on the Billboard Hot 100 chart and in the UK. The composition of Orbison's following hits reflected Running Scared, a story about an emotionally vulnerable man facing loss or grief, with a crescendo culminating in a surprise climax that employed Orbison's dynamic voice. Crying followed in July 1961 and reached. It was coupled with an up-tempo R by Fred Neil and Beverly Ross, which reached the Billboard Top 30, staying on the charts for 2 months. While Orbison was touring Australia in 1962, an Australian DJ referred to him affectionately as the Big O, partly based on the big finishes to his dramatic ballads, and the moniker stuck with him thereafter. Orbison's second son was born the same year, and Orbison hit number 4 in the US and number 2 in the UK with Dream Baby, an upbeat song by country songwriter Cindy Walker. Also in 1962 he charted with a Crowdly and Workin' for the Man, which he wrote about working one summer in the oil fields near Wink. His relationship with Joe Melson, however, was deteriorating. over Melson's growing concerns that his own solo career would never get off the ground. Lacking the photogenic looks of many of his rock and roll contemporaries, Orbison eventually developed a persona that did not reflect his personality. He had no publicist in the early 1960s, no presence in fan magazines, and his single sleeves did not feature his picture. Life magazine called him an anonymous celebrity. After leaving his thick eyeglasses on an airplane in 1963 while on tour with the Beatles, Orbison was forced to wear his prescription Wayfarer sunglasses on stage, and found that he preferred them. His biographers suggest that although he had a good sense of humor and was never morose, Orbison was very shy and suffered from severe stage fright. Wearing sunglasses helped him hide somewhat from the attention. The ever-present sunglasses led some people to assume then and now that the stationary performer was blind. The black clothes and desperation in his songs led to an aura of mystery and introversion. Years later, Orbison said, "I wasn't trying to be weird. You know, I didn't have a manager who told me to dress or how to present myself or anything. But the image developed of a man of mystery and a quiet man in black, somewhat of a recluse. Although I never was really." His dark and brooding persona, combined with his tremulous voice in lovelorn ballads marketed to teenagers, made Orbison into a superstar. During the early 1960s, he had a string of hits in 1963 with In Dreams Falling and Mean Woman Blues, coupled with Blue Bayou. He finished the year with a Christmas song written by Willie Nelson titled Pretty Paper. As In Dreams was released in April 1963, Orbison was asked to replace guitarist Wayne Eddy on a tour of the UK in top billing with the Beatles, whose popularity was on the rise. When he arrived in Britain, however, he saw the amount of advertising devoted to the quartet, and realized he was no longer the main draw. He had never heard of them and, annoyed, asked rhetorically, "What's a Beatle anyway?" To which John Lennon replied, after tapping his shoulder, "I am." On the opening night, Orbison opted to go on stage first. Although he was the more established act, known for having raucous shows expressing an extraordinary amount of energy, Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison and Ringo Starr stood dumbfounded backstage as Orbison performed completely still and simply sang through 14 encores. Finally, when the audience began chanting "We want Roy" again, Lennon and McCartney prevented Orbison from going on again by physically holding him back. Starr later said in Glasgow, "We were all backstage listening to the tremendous applause he was getting. He was just standing there, not moving or anything." Through the tour, however, the two acts quickly learned to get along, a process made easier by the fact that the Beatles admired his work. Orbison felt a kinship with Lennon, but it was Harrison with whom he would later form a strong friendship. Riding the success. Touring in 1963 took a toll on Orbison's personal life. His wife Claudette began having an affair with the contractor who built their home in Hendersonville, Tennessee. Friends and relatives attributed the breakdown of the marriage to her youth and her inability to withstand being alone and bored. When Orbison toured Britain again in the fall of 1963, she joined him. He was immensely popular wherever he went, finishing the tour in Ireland and Canada. Almost immediately he toured Australia and New Zealand with the Beach Boys, and returned again to Britain and Ireland, where he was besieged by teenage girls that the Irish police had to halt his performances to pull the girls off him. He continued to tour, traveling to Australia again, this time with the Rolling Stones. Mick Jagger later remarked, referring to a snapshot he took of Orbison in New Zealand, "A fine figure of a man in the hot springs he was." Orbison also began collaborating with Bill Dees, whom he had known in Texas. With Dees he wrote "It's Over" a #1 in the UK. and a song that would be one of his signature pieces for the rest of his career. When Claudette walked in the room where Dees and Orbison were writing to say she was heading for Nashville, Orbison asked if she had any money. Dees said, "A pretty woman never needs any money." Just 40 minutes later, "Oh Pretty Woman" was completed, a riff-laden masterpiece that employed a playful growl he got from a Bob Hope movie. The epithet "Mercy" Orbison uttered when he was unable to hit a note and emerging of his vulnerable and masculine size. It rose to number 1 in the fall of 1964 in the US and stayed on the charts for 14 weeks. It hit number 1 in the UK as well, spending 18 weeks total on the charts. The single sold over 7 million copies. Orbison's success was greater in Britain, as Billboard magazine noted in a 68-week period that began on August 8, 1963. Roy Orbison was the only American artist to have a number 1 single in Britain. He did it twice, with "It's Over" on June 25, 1964 and "Oh, Pretty Woman" on October 8, 1964. The latter song also went to number 1 in America, making Orbison impervious to the current chart dominance of British artists on both sides of the Atlantic. 1965–69, Career Decline and Tragedies. "Oh, Pretty Woman" proved the pinnacle of Orbison's career in the 1960s. Following its release, he endured some upheavals. He and Claudette divorced in November 1964 over her infidelities, but the two reconciled and got back together 10 months later. His contract with Monument was expiring in June 1965. Wesley Rose, at this time acting as Orbison's agent, moved him from Monument Records to Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer for $1 million, and the understanding that he would expand into television and films as Elvis Presley had done. Orbison was a film enthusiast and, when not touring, writing or recording, would dedicate time to seeing up to 3 films a day. Rose also became Orbison's producer. Fred Foster later suggested that Rose's takeover was responsible for the commercial failure of Orbison's work at MGM. Engineer Bill Porter agreed that Orbison's best work could only be achieved with RCA Nashville's A-Team. Orbison's first collection at MGM, an album titled There Is Only One Roy Orbison, sold fewer than 200,000 copies. With the onset of the British invasion in 1964–65, the direction of popular music shifted dramatically, and most performers of Orbison's generation were driven from the charts. While on tour again in the UK in 1965, Orbison broke his foot falling off a motorcycle in front of thousands of screaming fans. At a racetrack, he performed his show that evening in a cast. His reconciliation with Claudette occurred when she went to visit him while he was recuperating from the accident. Orbison was fascinated with machines. He was known to follow a car that he liked and make the driver an offer on the spot. He had a collection worthy of a museum. By the late 1960s, Orbison and Claudette shared a love for motorcycles. She had grown up around them, but he claimed Elvis Presley had introduced him to motorcycles. Tragedy struck on June 6, 1966, however, when Orbison and Claudette were riding home from Bristol, Tennessee. She struck the door of a pickup truck which had pulled out in front of her on Southwater Avenue in Gallatin, Tennessee, and died instantly. A grieving Orbison threw himself into his work, collaborating with Bill Dees to write music for The Fastest Guitar Alive, a film that MGM had scheduled for him to star in as well. It was initially planned as a dramatic western but was rewritten as a comedy. Orbison's character was a spy who stole and had to protect and deliver a cache of gold to the Confederate Army during the American Civil War, and was outfitted with a guitar that turned into a rifle. The prop allowed him to deliver the line, "I could kill you." with this and Play Your Funeral March at the same time with, according to biographer Colin Escott, zero conviction. Orbison was pleased with the film, although it proved to be a critical and box office flop. While MGM had included 5 films in his contract, no more were made. He recorded an album dedicated to the songs of Don Gibson, and another of Hank Williams' covers, but both sold poorly. During the counterculture era, with the charts dominated by artists like Jimi Hendrix, Jefferson Airplane, the Rolling Stones, and The Doors, Orbison felt lost and directionless, later saying, "I didn't hear a lot I could relate to, so I kind of stood there like a tree where the winds blow, and the seasons change and you're still there and you bloom again." He continued to tour, and had previously made some smart real estate investments, so money was never an issue for him again. During a tour of the Midlands in England on September 16, 1968, he received the news that his home in Hendersonville, Tennessee had burned down, and his 2 eldest sons had died. The property was sold to Johnny Cash, who demolished the building and planted an orchard on it. On March 25, 1969, Orbison married German teenager Barbara Jacobs, whom he had met several days before his sons' deaths. Wesley, his youngest son with Claudette, was raised by Orbison's parents. Orbison and Barbara had a son in 1970 and another in 1975. 1970s-80s. Orbison continued recording albums in the 1970s, but none of them sold more than a handful of copies, and by 1976 he had gone an entire decade without a charting album. Aside from a few minor hits in Australia, he also failed to produce any charting singles after the 60s. His fortunes sank so low that he began to doubt his own talents, and several of his 70s albums were not released internationally due to low US sales. He left MGM Records in 1973 and signed a 1-album deal with Mercury Records. Author Peter Lehman would later observe that his absence was a part of the mystery of his persona. Since it was never clear where he had come from, no one seemed to pay much mind to where he had gone. He was just gone. His influence was apparent, however, as several artists released covers of his songs which proved popular. Orbison's version of "Love Hurts," a song composed by Felice and Boodle Bryant and first recorded by the Everly Brothers, was remade by Gram Parsons and Emmylou Harris, again by hard rock band Nazareth, and by blues adept Jim Capaldi. Sonny James sent "Only the Lonely" to #1 on the country music charts. Bruce Springsteen ended his concerts with Orbison songs, and Glenn Campbell had a minor hit with a remake of Dream Baby. A compilation of Orbison's greatest hits went to #1 in the UK in January 1976. The same year he began to open concerts for the Eagles, who started as Linda Ronstadt's backup band. Ronstadt herself covered Blue Bayou in 1977, her version reaching #3 on the Billboard charts and remaining in the charts for 24 weeks. Orbison credited this cover in particular for reviving his memory in the popular mind, if not his career. He signed again with Monument in 1976 and recorded Regeneration with Fred Foster, but it proved no more successful than before. In late 1977, Orbison was not feeling well and decided to overwinter in Hawaii. While there, he checked into a hospital, where testing discovered that he had severely obstructed coronary arteries. On January 18, 1978, Orbison underwent a triple coronary bypass. He had suffered from duodenal ulcers since as early as 1960 and had been a heavy smoker since adolescence. He felt revitalized following the triple bypass, but he continued to smoke, and his weight fluctuated for the remainder of his life. When Orbison felt strong enough, To perform again, Scott Matthews took him into the recording studio and produced a version of "Oh, Pretty Woman" for a national radio and television advertising campaign for Tone Soap, a woman's beauty bar. This proved to be a much-needed financial windfall for Orbison, as Matthews saw to it that the company paid well to license the use of Orbison's original composition and for Orbison's services. In 1978, Orbison signed with Asylum and released one album a year later. In 1980, Don McLean covered "Crying" in a version which unexpectedly went to the top of the charts. At first in the Netherlands, afterwards hitting number 5 in the US and staying on the charts for 15 weeks. It was number 1 in the UK for 3 weeks and also topped the Irish charts. Although he was all but forgotten in the US, Orbison took a chance and embarked on a tour of Bulgaria. He was astonished to find that he was as popular there as he had been in 1964. He was forced to stay in his hotel room because he was mobbed on the streets of Sofia. Later that year, he and Emmylou Harris won a Grammy Award for their duet "That Lovin' You Feelin' Again." It was his first such award, and he felt more than ever that the time was ripe for his full return to popular music. However, it would be several more years until this came to fruition. In the meantime, Van Halen released a hard rock cover of "Oh Pretty Woman" on the 1982 album Diver Down Again, further exposing a younger generation to Orbison's legacy. Career revival. Orbison's career was fully revived in 1987. He released an album of his re-recorded hits, titled "In Dreams: The Greatest Hits." A song he recorded, "Life Fades Away," written with his friend Glenn Danzig, was featured in the film Less Than Zero. He and K.D. Lang performed a duet of "Crying" for inclusion on the soundtrack to the film Hiding Out, winning a Grammy for Best Country Collaboration with Vocals. However, one film in which Orbison refused to allow his music to be used was Blue Velvet. Director David Lynch asked to use "In Dreams" and Orbison initially declined Lynch's request. Lynch used it anyway. The song served as one of several obsessions of a psychopathic character named Frank Booth. It was lip-synced by an effeminate drug dealer played by Dean Stockwell, after which Booth demanded the song be played over and over, once beating the protagonist while the song played. During filming, Lynch asked for the song to be played repeatedly to give the set a surreal atmosphere. Orbison was initially shocked at its use. He saw the film in a theater in Malibu and later said, "I was mortified because they were talking about the candy-colored clown in relation to a dope deal. I thought, what in the world? But later when I was touring, we got the video out and I really got to appreciate what David gave to the song and what the song gave to the movie, how it achieved this otherworldly quality that added a whole new dimension to In Dreams." Also in 1987, Orbison was inducted into the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame and initiated into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame by Bruce Springsteen, who concluded his speech with a reference to his own album Born to Run. "I wanted a record with words like Bob Dylan that sounded like Phil Spector, but most of all I wanted to sing like Roy Orbison. Now everyone knows that no one sings like Roy Orbison." In response, Orbison asked Springsteen for a copy of the speech and said of his induction that he felt validated by the honor. A few months later, Orbison and Springsteen paired again to film a concert at the Coconut Grove nightclub in Los Angeles. They were joined by Jackson Browne, T-Bone Burnett, Elvis Costello, Tom Waits, Bonnie Raitt, Jennifer Warnes, James Burton and K.D. Lang. Lang later recounted how humbled Orbison had been by the display of support from so many talented and busy musicians. "Roy looked at all of us and said, 'If there is anything I can ever do for you, please call on me.' He was very serious. It was his way of thanking us. It was very emotional. The concert was filmed in one take, and aired on Cinemax under the title Roy Orbison and Friends, A Black and White Night. It was released on video by Virgin Records, selling 50,000 copies. Traveling Wilburys and Mystery Girl. It was also in 1987 that Orbison began collaborating with Electric Light Orchestra lead vocalist and bandleader Jeff Lynne on a new album. Concurrently, Lynne was completing production work on George Harrison's Cloud 9 album, and all three ate lunch together one day when Orbison accepted an invitation to sing on a song of Harrison's. They subsequently contacted Bob Dylan, who in turn allowed them to use a recording studio in his home. Along the way, Harrison made a quick visit to Tom Petty's residence to obtain his guitar. Petty and his band had backed Dylan on his last tour. By that evening, the group had written Handle with Care, which led to the concept of recording an entire album. They called themselves the Traveling Wilburys, representing themselves as half-brothers with the same father. They gave themselves stage names. Orbison chose his from his musical hero, calling himself Lefty Wilbury after Lefty Frizzell. Expanding on the concept of a traveling band of raucous musicians, Orbison offered a quote about the group's foundation in honor. "Some people say Daddy was a cad and a bounder. I remember him as a Baptist minister." Lynne later spoke of the recording sessions. "Everybody just sat there going, wow, it's Roy Orbison. Even though he's become your pal and you're hanging out and having a laugh and going to dinner as soon as he gets behind that mic, and he's doing his business. Suddenly it's shudder time." Orbison was given one solo track, Not Alone Anymore, on the album. His contributions were highly praised by the press. Traveling Wilburys Volume 1 spent 53 weeks on the US charts, peaking at number 3. It reached number 1 in Australia, and topped out at number 16 in the UK. The album won a Grammy for Best Rock Performance by a Duo or Group. Rolling Stone included it in the top 100 albums of the decade. Orbison was in high demand for concerts and interviews once again, and was seemingly ecstatic about it. He began writing songs and collaborating with many musicians from his past and newer fans to develop a solo album, Mystery Girl. Mystery Girl was co-produced by Jeff Lynne, whom Orbison considered the best producer he had ever collaborated with. Elvis Costello, Orbison's son Wesley, and others offered their songs to him. The biggest hit from the album was You Got It, written with Lynne and Tom Petty. It posthumously rose to number 9 in the US and number 3 in the UK. In 2014, a demo of Orbison's The Way Is Love was released as part of the 25th anniversary deluxe edition of Mystery Girl. The song was originally recorded on a stereo cassette player around 1986. Orbison's sons contributed instrumentation on the track along with Roy's vocals. It was produced by John Carter Cash. Although the video for the Wilburys' Handle with Care was filmed with Orbison, the video for End of the Line was filmed and released posthumously. During Orbison's vocal parts in End of the Line, the video shows a guitar in a rocking chair next to Orbison's framed photo. Death. Orbison determinedly pursued his second chance at stardom, but he expressed amazement at his success. "It's very nice to be wanted again, but I still can't quite believe it." He lost some weight to fit his new image and the constant demand of touring, as well as the newer demands of making videos. In the final 3 months of his life, he gave Rolling Stone magazine extensive access to his daily activities. He intended to write an autobiography and wanted Martin Sheen to play him in a biopic. In November 1988, Mystery Girl was completed and Traveling Wilburys Volume 1 was rising up the charts. Around this time, Orbison confided in Johnny Cash that he was having chest pains and said he would have to do something about his health, but he never did. He went to Europe, was presented with an award there, and played a show in Antwerp where footage for the video for You Got It was filmed. He gave several interviews a day in a hectic schedule. A few days later, a manager at a club in Boston was concerned that he looked ill, but Orbison played the show to another standing ovation. Orbison performed at the Front Row Theatre in Highland Heights, Ohio, on December 4. Exhausted, he returned to his home in Hendersonville to rest for several days before flying again to London to film 2 more videos for the traveling Wilburys. On December 6, he spent the day flying model airplanes with his sons and ate dinner at his mother's home in Hendersonville. Later that day, he died of a heart attack at the age of 52. The tabloid National Enquirer suggested on its cover that Orbison had worked himself to death. A memorial was held in Nashville and another in Los Angeles. He was buried at Westwood Village Memorial Park Cemetery on April 8, 1989. Orbison became the first deceased musician since Elvis Presley to have 2 albums in the US top 5 at the same time, with the Traveling Wilburys album at number 4 and his own Mystery Girl at number 5. In the United Kingdom, he achieved even greater posthumous success with 2 solo albums in the top 3 in the chart, dated to February 11, 1989, Mystery Girl at number 2 and the compilation, The Legendary Roy Orbison, at number 3. Style and influence. Orbison is counted as a rock and roll pioneer and has been cited by numerous critics as one of the genre's most influential musicians, but his style is notable for how it departed from the norm. Rock and roll in the 1950s was defined by a driving backbeat, heavy guitars and lyrical themes that glorified youthful rebellion. Few of Orbison's recordings have these characteristics. The structure and themes of his songs defied convention, and his much-praised voice and performance style were unlike any other in rock and roll. Many of his contemporaries compared his music with that of classically trained musicians, although he never mentioned any classical music influences. Author Peter Lehman summarized it, writing, "He achieved what he did not by copying classical music but by creating a unique form of popular music that drew upon a wide variety of music popular." During his youth, bassist Jerry Scheff, who backed Orbison in his A Black and White Night concert, wrote about him, "Roy Orbison was like an opera singer. His voice melted out of his mouth into the stratosphere and back. He never seemed like he was trying to sing, he just did it." Song structures. Music critic Dave Marsh also wrote that these compositions define a world unto themselves more completely than any other body of work in pop music. Orbison's music, like the man himself, has been described as timeless, diverting from contemporary rock and roll and bordering on the eccentric, within a hair's breadth of being weird. New York Times writer Peter Watrous declared in a concert review, "He has perfected an odd vision of popular music, one in which eccentricity and imagination beat back all the pressures toward conformity." In the 1960s, Orbison refused to splice edits of songs together and insisted in recording them in single takes, with all the instruments and singers together. The only convention Orbison followed in his most popular songs is the time limit for radio fare in pop songs. Otherwise, each seems to follow a separate structure, using the standard 32-bar form for verses and choruses. Normal pop songs followed the verse-chorus, bridge, verse-chorus structure, where A represents the verse, B represents the chorus, and C the bridge. Most pop songs can be represented by AB, ABC, AB, like Ooby Dooby and Claudette. Orbison's In Dreams was a song in 7 movements that can be represented as intro A, B, C, D, E, F. No sections are repeated. In Running Scared, however, the entire song repeats to build suspense to a final climax to be represented as A, B. Crying is more complex, changing parts toward the end to be represented as A, B, C, D, E, F, A, B, C, D, E, F. Although Orbison recorded and wrote standard structure songs before Only the Lonely, he claimed never to have learned how to write them. Elton John's songwriting partner and main lyricist Bernie Taupin wrote that Orbison's songs always made radical left turns, and K.D. Lang declared that good songwriting comes from being constantly surprised, such as how the entirety of Running Scared eventually depends on the final note, one word. Some of the musicians who worked with Orbison were confounded by what he asked them to do. Nashville session guitarist Jerry Kennedy stated Roy went against the grain. The first time you'd hear something it wouldn't sound right, but after a few playbacks, it would start to grow on you. Themes of songs. Critic Dave Marsh categorizes Orbison's ballads into themes reflecting pain and loss and dreaming. A third category is his up-tempo rockabilly songs such as Go, 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 and Mean Woman Blues that are more thematically simple, addressing his feelings and intentions in a masculine braggadocio. In concert, Orbison placed the up-tempo songs between the ballads to keep from being too consistently dark or grim. In 1990, Colin Escott wrote an introduction to Orbison's biography published in a CD box set. Orbison was the master of compression. Working the singles era, he could relate a short story or establish a mood in under 3 minutes. If you think that's easy, try it. His greatest recordings were quite simply perfect, not a word or note surplus to intention. After attending a show in 1988, Peter Watrous of the New York Times wrote that Orbison's songs are dreamlike, claustrophobically intimate set pieces. Music critic Ken Emerson writes that the apocalyptic romanticism in Orbison's music was well crafted for the films his songs appeared in the 1980s because the music was so over the top that dreams become delusions and self-pity, paranoia, striking a postmodern nerve. Led Zeppelin singer Robert Plant favored American R. But beyond the black musicians, he named Elvis and Orbison especially as foreshadowing the emotions he would experience. The poignancy of the combination of lyric and voice was stunning. Orbison used drama to great effect, and he wrote dramatically. The loneliness in Orbison's songs that he became most famous for he both explained and downplayed. I don't think I've been any more lonely than anyone else. Although if you grow up in West Texas there are a lot of ways to be lonely. His music offered an alternative to the postured masculinity that was pervasive in music and culture. Robin Gibb of the Bee Gees stated, he made emotion fashionable, that it was all right to talk about and sing about very emotional things. For men to sing about very emotional things. Before that no one would do it. Orbison acknowledged this in looking back on the era in which he became popular. When Crying came out, I don't think anyone had accepted the fact that a man should cry when he wants to cry. Peter Lehman, on the other hand, considered Orbison's theme of constant vulnerability an element of sexual masochism. Voice quality. Orbison admitted that he did not think his voice was put to appropriate use until Only the Lonely in 1960, when it was able, in his words, to allow its flowering. Carl Perkins, however, toured with Orbison while they were both signed with Sun Records, and recalled a specific concert when Orbison covered the Nelson Eddy and Jeanette MacDonald standard Indian Love Call and had the audience completely silenced in awe. When compared to the Everly Brothers, who often used the same session musicians, Orbison is credited with a passionate intensity that, according to the Rolling Stone Illustrated History of Rock and Roll, made his love, his life, and indeed the whole world, seem to be coming to an end, not with a whimper but an agonized beautiful bang. Bruce Springsteen and Billy Joel both commented on the otherworldly quality of Orbison's voice. Dwight Yoakam stated that Orbison's voice sounded like the cry of an angel falling backward through an open window. Barry Gibb of the Bee Gees went further to say that when he heard crying for the first time, that was it. To me, that was the voice of God. Elvis Presley stated his voice was the greatest and most distinctive he had ever heard. Orbison's music and voice have been compared to opera by Bob Dylan, Tom Waits, and songwriter Will Jennings, among others. Dylan marked Orbison as a specific influence, remarking that there was nothing like him on radio in the early 1960s. Likewise, Tim Goodwin, who conducted the orchestra that backed Orbison in Bulgaria, had been told that Orbison's voice would be a singular experience to hear. When Orbison started with crying and hit the high notes, Goodwin stated, Orbison's severe stage fright was particularly noticeable in the 1970s and early 1980s. During the first few songs in a concert, the vibrato in his voice was almost uncontrollable, but afterwards it became stronger and more dependable. This also happened with age. Orbison noticed that he was unable to control the tremor in the late afternoon and evenings and chose to record in the mornings when it was possible. Performance. Orbison often excused his motionless performances by saying that his songs did not allow instrumental sections so he could move or dance on stage. Although songs like Mean Woman Blues did offer that, he was aware of his unique performance style even in the early 1960s when he commented, "I'm not a super personality, on stage or off. I mean, you could put workers like Chubby Checker or Bobby Riddle in second-rate shows and they'd still shine through, but not me. I'd have to be prepared. People come to hear my music, my songs. That's what I have to give them." Lang compared Orbison to a tree with passive but solid beauty. This image of Orbison as immovable was so associated with him it was parodied by John Belushi on Saturday Night Live as Belushi dressed as Orbison falls over while singing "Oh, Pretty Woman" and continues to play as his bandmate set him upright again. However, Lang quantified this style by saying it's so hard to explain what Roy's energy was like, because he would fill a room with his energy and presence but not say a word, being that he was so grounded and so strong and so gentle and quiet. He was just there. Orbison attributed his own passion during his performances to the period when he grew up in Fort Worth while the U.S. was mobilizing for World War II. His parents worked in a defense plant and his father would bring a guitar in the evenings, and their friends and relatives who had just joined the military would gather and drink and sing heartily. Orbison later reflected, "I guess that level of intensity made a big impression on me because it's still there. That sense of do it for all it's worth and do it now and do it good, not to analyze it too much. But I think the verve and gusto that everybody felt and portrayed around me has stayed with me all this time." Brought to you by WikiVidi.com. Would you like to know more?